So what I was saying before I started the recording was this is something I was introduced to, teaching linguistics, and it's about how connections are defined, and you actually get interesting insights because of this. And then I started seeing it when they're talking about how blogs interact with each other, and Facebook friends, and how the flu spreads, and economic transactions. So I think it's something that would be good for us to know about, especially in terms of analytics. So SNA is just social network analysis. And have any of you heard about it?
Yep.
All right, so I know some of you know and some of you don't. So it talks about how people are connected into communities, and there are some interesting generalizations, and as I mentioned, there are applications, and particularly in the social sciences, but also in biology. And you may have seen this. This is a basic social network graph. So this is Joe Collegiate or Jill Collegiate. And so each person is a node, it's a little circle. And Joe has high school friends, and his high school friends all know each other. And he has his summer job friends, and the summer job friends know each other, and work friends and college friends. In this particular case, so most of his communities don't interact much with each other except for this green dot. I guess that's B Collegiate, who works with him, but also he knows through whichever college, which I'll assume is Penn State since it's blue. So, it's a basic network graph. And just some definitions. The node is the person or entity. So in economics, you might have graphs of different countries.
Could you share your screen?
Oh, okay.
So that
Let me try this again. All right, I thought I had, but my bad. So
now we can.
okay, great, thanks.
There it is.
All right, so this is, I don't think we got too many strange pictures, so. So this is the graph I was talking about with Joe Collegiate, the work community. So these are the dots who talk to each other. These are nodes in more technical terms. And then these lines here, which I often call connections, but are technically called edges, so it's a good term to know about. And one term I don't have in there is a degree, so which is how many connections you have. So Jay here has a fairly high degree, about 9 or 10, whereas in his worldview, this person here has maybe a degree of 3. It's kind of on the edge of this person's network. So this is a network as defined around an individual, and depending on what you're studying, nodes could be different countries. So in economics, they might talk about trade networks, and this might be U.S., Singapore, Canada, or something like that. But for the most part, I'll just be dealing with people. And communities are those which share connections or edges. So this is a community because they share a lot of edges within each other, but not outside each other. And so this is very helpful for thinking about questions such as who's really interacting with who, really, and in the workplace it might be who's really interacting with who versus what the org chart thinks is interacting with who. It can be very helpful. How is information being transmitted in the network, especially learning? Are there key cliques or sub-communities in the network? Because obviously the tighter the community, the more quickly information is shared, but on the outer edges, not so much. It'll be a lot slower. And who's the most critical? So again, this is especially in a work environment, you're thinking about, common question we have at Penn State is how do we disseminate information to all of Penn State? Well, we have to understand the network to make it the most efficient. And I think people actually have an intuitive understanding of networks. So we're going to have a little exercise here. So we have, I'm going to pretend this is a college network or a high school network. And so we have questions such as, the original question is, well, everyone goes away in spring break and one person comes back with a new illness, new to the community. So, and it just so happens that Casey's the center of the universe. So if Casey comes back, how quickly is the flu going to spread? She had a really great time, by the way.
Very quickly.
Right.
Yeah, because she knows everyone, and so she's going to come in contact with anyone. So, as opposed to Anne, how many people can Anne affect?
4.
4. So, so a question that I've always wondered is, why do introverts still exist when people are constantly talking about, and I'm an introvert, so I always wonder this, talking about how, disconnected they are from society. I think this is part of it, is they're the last ones infected or something like that. But if another issue we wanted to talk about, someone wants to generate student awareness. So Bill has an issue. Who would he want to go to get word out to the most people?
Who would Bill go to?
Yeah, who would Bill go to?
Tony.
Tony, right? And why would he go to Tony?
It's a single connection point.
Yeah, because then Tony can go to Casey. So Tony is what is known as a broker, meaning Tony connects two groups, and Tony's one of the few links. And suppose, suppose you notice on this group I have Juan, Maria, and Rita, so this is my fake Latino community, and other names are more Anglo. So suppose for some reason there was some kind of dispute over some issue between the Latino student community and the rest of the community. Who would be the best person? Rita. So, Rita's the one who understands both sides probably. But if you wanted your biggest bang for your buck, like a SON level type thing, there are several people you might want to go to, but probably Casey again would be someone you want to go to. So, see, we pretty much took care of that. So there are some concepts. One is the center, and that's the person with lots and lots of edges or connections. In most network, it often correlates with high social prestige. So, when Cole says something, we all tend to listen. If I say something, some people listen. And it depends on the community. So it could be officials or social organizers or spiritual leaders. But in informal communities, it could just be the cool person, whoever that is. And they're very influential for creating community consensus. So viral marketers often do social network analysis to figure out who these people are. So, and I think also they talk about if you're a woman and you're interested in becoming the Avon lady, the more central you are in the network, probably the better sales you're going to have. So that's the kind of person they want doing this kind of thing. But on the other hand, outliers are important too for network diversity. We'll talk about that. So of course, then you do have the outliers. So let me go back here. We mentioned Anne. What might be another example of an outlier? Grace, yeah. She can get information to Casey, but it's going to take a while, and she's only got one path to do it. And there are mixed social connotations, so it might be someone who's sort of the lone wolf, who's someone who sort of wants to be isolated, just doesn't want to bother. But it could also be someone just who has low prestige. And like I said, they can be a source of network diversity, but then again, there are other issues with being an outlier, especially if you don't want to be an outlier. And finally, we talked about brokers, which may not be center, but they provide bridges between different groups of nodes. So it can be a valuable way for outsiders to contact a central player. And if you're a researcher looking for access to a community, you usually want to find some sort of broker. And they can also be information conduits in and out, or they can block information. And some brokers are central, but not all of them are. And in the real world, you might think about a political spouse. So Michelle Obama doesn't have any official power, but she's one heck of a broker. Or other consultants. A community spokesperson might be an example of a broker who has some central prestige. But again, maybe there's someone else who actually has more political prestige. Or what I'm going to call a bicultural individual, so someone who's like a multilingual speaker, they know Spanish and they know English, or someone from a community that normally isn't represented in higher education who goes into higher education. So we have someone in the German department who grew up Amish, and so he's studying Pennsylvania German because he has access to that community that you can possibly have. And because they're on this bridge, some brokers may not be 100% trusted, but others are. Yes, they kind of do a little digging. So how many of you, I'm going to use Veronica Mars as an example. How many of you have seen this? I think one or two. But anyway, if those of you who haven't seen it, this is Veronica Mars, Kristen Bell. She's a high school super sleuth, and the whole story was she used to be in the pep squad, and then her father messed up a murder investigation, or so they thought, and he lost the election. And then, so she had social prestige through her father, and then she started losing it, and so she became an outlier. And the theme song was, "We used to be friends, but I haven't thought about you lately." A lot of social network issues in this show. So once she becomes a super sleuth, she develops her super sleuth social network here. So these are her old pep squad friends. And then the PCH gang is the Pacific Coast Highway motorcycle gang. So she needs to find out what's going on the down low. She goes talk to them. So
Well, she does it through one point, that character Weevil?
Yeah, Weevil. This is Weevil, he's our broker. And after a while, the PCH gang started to distrust him because he kept hanging out with Veronica all the time, and he actually started to do things like graduate.
Street cred.
That's right.
He started losing his street cred, but this is when he still had street cred, so he's looking suspiciously to make sure no one sees this blonde chick hanging out on his porch. And then, did anyone see the one outlier on the community?
Beaver?
Yeah. So this is Beaver. He looks a little threatening, and it turns out in season 2 that he's responsible for, causing a bus accident and blowing up a helicopter.
He does look guilty.
Yeah. So he ends up being we're all worrying about our typical rampage killers, and I actually saw this on Nova. And there are a number of danger sides, but one of them actually is someone who's an outlier who wants to join in. So this is part of the motivation for going on a rampage is to get attention that you weren't getting before. That doesn't mean, by the way, that anyone who's just hanging out looking morose is going to be a rampage killer. Because otherwise I'd have killed everyone by now. I mean, if you're high school, don't worry.
Nudge your node closer to the middle.
Yeah. But, if you're interested in learning more about that, is Catherine Newman, and she has a CNN thing. But that's the kind of thing that we're starting to see, which leads into my next topic, which is dense versus loose network. And that's another really important parameter. So density is just basically how many connections per node and how strong are those connections. So 2 workers are a relatively weak connection, but if you're 2 co-workers who also live together and go out to lunch every day, or your neighbors or whatever, your connection is stronger. So a loose network is something like this, where I think of this as a typical UP student network. So you, and then you go to your dentist in University Park, and your math instructor and your language instructor, and as far as you know, your math instructor and language instructor never talk to each other. That might not be the case in reality, but when you're a student, you don't realize how faculty actually interact with each other. So the Penn State student, I think, has one view of how the network works versus faculty and staff. And a dense one, obviously, is everyone talks to each other. They may work and socialize together, and they're more common in smaller populations, so a neighborhood in a city or a small town or a college town. And then I always think this is the quintessential dense network. This is the network that people get that. So, you've got, Rachel and Ross are boyfriend and girlfriend, and Rachel and Monica were roommates, and Ross and Monica are brother and sister. So Ross is dating his sister's best friend, and Monica's married to her brother's best friend, and so forth and so on. But you also have looser connections. So Gunther actually, he's the bar guy, technically talks to everyone, but he only takes coffee orders from them and shows up to a party or two. He never actually gets to sit at the couch. So his connection isn't as strong. And again, studies are finding that this is an important variable. So if you're talking about whether you have a Cajun accent or not in Louisiana, they went to a parish, which is a traditional Cajun parish, but not everyone has the accent, and it turns out that the more outside interactions you have, the less likely you are to have the Cajun pronunciation, which they've actually quantified it. So, if you have more connections, you're more likely to have the Cajun. So standard is and the, and Cajun is the, three, and the, something like that. So, woohoo!
Cajun man from
Like on the
Saturday Night
crocodile
Live.
hunter.
Yeah. So, and again, we all know this, so it's that old thing, like, some people will just stay in the same neighborhood and they marry each other, and they're more likely to have a local accent versus someone who goes off to Penn State. So here's an exercise I thought might be fun for us, which is, I'm going to do everything except the last one. So how many points can you get for if you attended Penn State before you got your current job, assuming you're working here, each relative who attended Penn State, each child at Penn State, any coworkers you had dinner with the last month, any acquaintances you met at Wegmans or Macy's or Bryce Jordan Center or whatever, and any sporting events you attended this year. So give us a few minutes and see what kinds of numbers we get.
To clarify the acquaintance one, you mean number of times you ran into an acquaintance at Wegmans?
Yeah.
Or you met somebody for the first time? Just how many times you have run?
Someone like from somewhere else. So like if I ran into Jeff at Wegmans.
Sporting event is any?
Penn State sporting event.
Penn State.
Yeah. I should have explained that clear. I'm going to say mine is about an 8.
Mine was 4.
Mine's 5.
I only have like 5. Okay.
2.
I have an exceptionally strong connection. I'm surprised. And I'm not counting the neighbor who also works in ITS and takes care of my dogs.
You're at the center square.
Who knew? So, but I think a lot of people actually have closer ties than I think students do. Because I know a lot of people, especially in ETS, I know a lot of people who were students at Penn State before they got hired here. And just something else to think about when we're thinking about student environment, who do you think would likely have the highest connection strength to Penn State? Or which groups in general?
Based on like the previous criteria?
Yeah.
On the previous criteria.
Well, I will say I did this with students, and so connections, I also said count their relatives, but also if they knew anyone from their high school.
I would put staff.
Any other thoughts?
Undergrad? That's what I was leaning. I'm in the middle between staff and undergrad.
Well, actually, I kind of thought, yeah, I thought staff, because so many staff here at Penn State were former students. So they sort of stayed here, but undergrad students, I think undergrad, it probably is split between those who do and those who don't. So, like, if you're an undergrad and you're from a Penn State family, then you have a strong connection, but if you're from out of state, it might not be as strong, especially if you're an undergrad student from State College, then your connection is really, really strong. And in terms of the weakest,
Grad student.
yeah, that was my thought too. Especially since a lot of grad students, a lot of them are from other countries.
Right.
And also, when you're figuring out where you want to go to undergrad, you might be thinking emotional connection. You've always wanted to go to a certain place. But grad student, it's more, well, I want to study this. So more prosaic. And another group I was thinking of, maybe some faculty, especially the younger faculty, until they sort of settle in, might have weaker connections. You're thinking about all the stuff that's been happening recently. It's kind of an interesting question. And another parameter which can be important is direction. So is the relationship the same on both sides? So as an example, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, since I read comics. You just assume they're colleagues and they just sort of fight along each other and hang out in the Hall of Justice or whatever, but it's about the same on both sides, whereas is fond of is this relationship. So, you know, you watch Superman movies or cartoons, you know that Clark Kent is fond of Lois Lane, and Lois Lane is fond of Superman, but not necessarily a Clark Kent. And then hopefully Clark Kent and Superman are fond of each other, since they're the same person. That was what I said.
Self-loathing Superman.
Yeah, you never know. But, you know, so in some, you know, Clark sort of has the least amount of power because he's always chasing after Lois. And Superman has the most power because Lois is chasing after him. So it can also indicate, besides social hierarchies, information flow. So again, if someone with high prestige in the network is giving out information. So Kevin Maroney is giving out information since he's the head of ITS. Everyone in ITS tends to read it. And I'll also say tech support. Yeah, I hate to say this, we can hear conversations, so just so you know.
Yeah, just post it, asking if there was any questions or comments
Yeah.
you would like to share.
I think that's off topic there. And then, so some connections they're directionless, so we assume Facebook, Twitter friends, you know, I'm your friend, you're my friend. You know, that's sort of where it ends. Students, colleagues, things like that, all else being equal, it's sort of the same relationship. But again, talking about social media, who's commenting on who, so that might be an indication of directionality. Which blogs are read first. So they talk about the blogosphere, you know, this blog has more reads than that blog, so the one with the higher reads has more influence, or friend requests, or in the real world, instructor-student, it's an asymmetrical relationship, or manager and employee. And then sort of another thing to talk about is communities and sub-communities. So as a generalization, because communities talk to each other more, they can quickly come to consensus, although sometimes it can be so much consensus it's an echo chamber. So you want to sort of, sometimes even though a community doesn't quickly come to decision, that's not a bad thing, because taking time to figure something out means you might have come up with something better than you would have on the first pass. But on the flip side, if you have sub-communities, they can polarize, because the one community comes to consensus A, the other community comes to consensus B, and they just don't talk to each other as much. So a question I always asking my students is, are you really hearing multiple perspectives on things? So the echo chamber effect, also known as homophily, is you tend to view information that you already know you agree with, and you socialize with people that you like, which makes sense, unless you need to exit the echo chamber. And I have to add that the homophily comment was the one Dana Boyd was commenting on when she was getting mocked on Twitter for some reason, so they weren't buying it for...
That incident a couple years ago?
Yeah, that was actually the topic she was talking about, was homophilous community, so that's where I learned about it. So an example, this is sort of a famous example, so these are, I'm assuming these are progressive blogs like the Daily Post and the Huffington Post, and these are conservative blogs that can't even read them, like Rush Limbaugh or some other ones. So as you get to they started taking away nodes so that only the most influential blogs are left. So as you can see, basically the blue blogs read each other and never see what's happening on the other side, and the red blogs read each other and never see what's happening on the other side. Except for maybe a very few individuals right in here who are reading both, but they're not that influential. So some people think this is sort of one explanation of why there's a lot of political polarization right now. Of course, that means you'd have to actually read the other side's blog to get out of this. So some people, that's a challenge. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. I don't have a solution. I just wanted to point out that was a phenomenon. And then there are lots of network configurations you can talk about. I think one that's important for the Penn State is the hierarchical network. So this is sort of your typical org chart type thing. So Barry's in charge of the unit, and he has Helen, Jose, and Rob. And then in Helen's units, I don't label everyone, but everyone starts with an H. You can't get hired in Helen's unit unless your name begins with an H. Or,
Same across the board.
yeah, so yeah, the idea that. So in terms of communication, you know, these four up here are actually communicating very well. So Rob knows what Helen's doing, and Jose knows what everyone's doing. But if Henry encounters some kind of problem that Rob needs to know about, it would be really difficult to get through. So because Henry has to go through Helen and then go through Rob. So, and especially if for some reason like Helen, Jose, and Rob have a lot of email, you can have problems that way. So property is communication paths can be limited if you are truly hierarchical only, but they're denser towards the top, whatever that means. And just something to think about, large organizations, I think we all know this, like Penn State, and also the classroom. So, you know, many lecture halls, it's teacher to students, and maybe a few of the students are talking to each other. But unless you really work at it, it's very hard. So that's one reason why team projects are so popular, is it does let students talk to each other. And then one question that you may be thinking, well, how do we know where these communities are? I'm just making these communities up on the fly. One way is to look at social network transactions. So that's why I'm thinking, oh, Yammer. It's like the best social network laboratory ever, because it doesn't necessarily respect hierarchical ties. So, you know, the fact that we know who's joining them and who's talking on them lets us know. And especially since I've been doing a lot with accessibility, and we've been trying to leverage the informal networks as well as the formal networks. This has been an interesting laboratory for that. So that would be an awesome set of data to get, but you do have to think about, anyone remember the AOL debacle? They posted search results by user ID.
No.
They did this a few years ago. There's some social scientists at AOL just posted a whole bunch of search data results. And technically there weren't names there, but there was enough information that you could deduce like who certain user IDs were.
That's what you're looking at on the weekend.
Oh, you know.
Yeah. User 927.
I enjoy nuclear warheads.
Okay. So, yeah, you know, there's a lot of data out there, but there are those ethical issues. Other techniques have included surveys. So my favorite one was, who do you want to eat lunch with? They did this in a middle school. It was kind of sad. Viral, so you ask, so I know someone in the community, and then I ask that person to send me to other people, and that's really good for certain closed communities. But it also works for things like New Jersey dialect survey. So they found some people who lived in New Jersey since they were born, and they said, send this out, but make sure that they've lived in New Jersey so many years. And then brokers, which I mentioned, you look for someone who with an into the community. Then there's other things in software. So there's some open software things. There's one called Geppy on Java, but the problem, which is pretty decent, but then you have to downgrade your Java to Java 6 on the Mac. So, and I haven't found any other alternatives, but they're on Wikipedia. There are also Python libraries if you're a coder. And then the one thing I haven't even touched on are different mathematical models. Yeah. But they're important because you can construct certain models and predict how communities might form or how information might flow through. So, and if you've got really large networks, you do need calculations to figure out who's connecting to who. Otherwise, you'll be looking through a lot of Excel data. And in terms of education technology, I've been thinking, in addition to looking at Yammer data or other types of social media data, thinking about how do learning communities form. And I know in some online courses they're taking advantage of a cohort model for this reason, but are there other ways to find out informal learning communities out there? Because even undergrads have them once you get into the same major. And innovation support. So one problem we were always running into was, how do we let people know that we've got this new clicker tool?
Right.
You have our traditional paths, but can we figure out other paths out there? And these are the references. The first one actually is a MOOC on Coursera that I took in earlier last year, actually, in 2012. And I think it's due to run again, but there's another one from Stanford that's opened up today. And then these are two books. The social network analysis for startups is pretty good because it assumes that you're not a sociologist or a math whiz, so it's pretty straightforward, but it does assume you're going to program in Python, which may not be the case. And then the second one is for sociologists. It's a little math heavy, but maybe more for someone who's into this. So.
We have a question
All right.
from Hejan. Is there anything Elizabeth would caution researchers who want to adopt this method? What are some limitations? Also, is there follow-up?
Limitations. Well, there's the ethical. And
可以提问，突然有人在那边帮我念。
I think, and I have to say, I'm learning a little bit about the math, but you want to know which mathematical model you're choosing and why you're choosing it. So I might say someone is central. Well, it turns out there are 4 or 5 different ways of figuring out what you mean by central. Like, one obvious one is how many connections you have, but as someone pointed out, Ashton Kutcher has 1 million viewers on Twitter, or 1 million followers, but he doesn't really have a close connection with all 1 million of them. So, is that the same kind of connection, whereas someone at Penn State has 100 followers? You know, that might be more meaningful in a way.
So it depends on your question then with the frame.
Yeah.
Statistical model.
Yeah, you definitely need to look at the actual mathematical model.
Hejan.
I have a question. Is this something that you would look at before you model something, or would this be something after you have would this be something that you would look at after you have something in place? Like, when do you typically run the analysis? To figure out what you want to mold your item to be like, or do you want
To see
who's using it openly to get your analytics?
Again, I think it depends on the question. So, if you're trying to discover what the community is right now, probably what you would collect are transaction pairs. So, for instance, if I was looking at accessibility transactions in Yammer, I would identify certain groups and I would look for who's the members in the group maybe and who posts and who comments. So, you know, I post something, someone replies to me, so that is a paired transaction. And you put the pairs into software and it magically creates a map for you based on different parameters. But if you're just you're kind of trying to tweak the theory, you might, a lot of what people do they'll run a program and they'll say, all right, what happens if I create a fake network and, I think they were talking about information dissemination. So information can't fully disseminate unless it goes to 3 people. How quickly does it disseminate? Or how quickly does information disseminate in one network configuration, like a hierarchical network versus a non-hierarchical network? That kind of question. So that's more theoretical. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I read a study by Stanley Milgram back in the 60s. And do you remember the movie 6 Degrees of Separation, and the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon? Well, it's actually it's based on Milgram's statistical principle. He actually tried it where he had a lawyer friend in New York, and he picked this town in Des Moines, Iowa, and he sent out random letters to people there and saying, if you know this person, please contact them, or if you know someone who knows them, to get the letter to them. And that's what he found, that there was actually an average of 6 degrees. And what's really wild is that as you expand it, the number holds. So, you know, as he expanded it out farther in the U.S., the number held. As he went, you know, into other countries, the number held. And so it's called small world theory is what they call it. But 6 degrees of separation is actually based on a very strong statistical probability.
So when George Siemens was here in one of the MOOC discussions, he actually showed a social network analysis from his MOOC, which was really interesting. And I think the caveat that he had within his talks about learning analytics and stuff is it's not what the data tells you, it's what questions arise from it. So an example that he showed was using Twitter, there was another co-instructor who was like messaged, messaged more often in Twitter than he was, but he was retweeted more often. So asking the question like, why is that? And it turned out that that person was the most familiar with the platform, so he ended up getting a lot of technical support questions that were just sort of directional, whereas so George Siemens was the bigger influencer of that week, but the other person was the bigger communicator. You know, so it's like it kind of shows those kind of things are interesting. But I mean, I think it's interesting to ask questions like, is this something that we can look at, you know, for some of the tools that we use, or some of our, you know, the MOOCs that will be coming out?
So yeah, for instance, Coursera, a question I might have would be, I noticed in a lot of them, they'll have message board by countries. So do people stay within their country, or do they try and communicate across the country? And maybe it depends on which message board you're in.
It'd be interesting to ask the question, is there a correlation between persistence and community? You know, because they have such high dropout rates.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating question.
So is this something that, a concept you think will help people at some point?
I think so. I mean, I think it parallels really nicely with learning analytics, and particularly because so much of where learning happens is kind of disaggregated for us, that, you know, all students kind of poured in through Angel, but like not a lot of activity necessarily happens there. So like, how do we look at where activity is happening? And
Yeah, it kind of, in looking at your demo, one of the things that jumped out at me is, like, for dissemination, brokers would really become key as far as getting information across, you know, across islands.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, because, you know, in a badge model, we're moving towards the idea that information is just disaggregated. So you might get one badge in a skill here, and another badge in another skill here. What does that mean in terms of how do you hook up between two learning communities, for example? And is there a ramp-up time? So whenever you join a new community, there's sort of this initiation period you have to go through before you really can optimize the learning. So what does that mean? There's probably, I guess another caveat is, what's the anthropology behind it? Some of those.
Well, yeah, because even, you know, like traditionally online, communities of practice took place in discussion forums, which served as kind of the walled church basement where communities would kind of get together. And, you know, like in my dissertation, what I looked at was actually, could a community of practice be sustained over disaggregated features on social network sites? And what does it look like, you know, to do it out in the open where everyone is there, as opposed to going to a certain place to be a certain aspect of yourself?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Any other thoughts for the good of the order?
Looking at good of the order, like when you showed the hierarchical map, you know, and looking at how ITS is so disaggregated, it would seem then that, you know, the managers as being brokers are kind of key as far as when we looking at it as saying where communication breaks down. It most likely then is happening between Helen, Jose, and Rob, whereas it's like, you know, Barry says, well, I told this in the meeting, why doesn't Jack know to do this, you know, or, you know, Hallie told Helen about this project that's going to influence Rob's group, you know, why isn't Ricardo working on this?
Yeah, I think, to me, that sort of, I was sort of thinking, oh, that's sort of, you know, we talk about our silos, how do you break out of that?
Yeah, and Jackie, says, you know, like campus IDs and IT, you know, are part of ITS, but, you know, the physical proximity, the physical location is a challenge. So how does information get disseminated there through distance? Because that's a great point, Jackie, because you can't accidentally stumble. It's harder to accidentally stumble upon information than, just from hearing a conversation or something.
And I can't, and maybe modes is important. So maybe, I wait till I run into someone in the hallway before I talk to them because I think it might be easier, but I can't do that with the campus ID.
Right. And, another thing that, is, for creativity within organizations, creativity kind of happens by accident, of these, chance encounters when you just happen to be at a certain spot in time working through a problem, and, I see Lori in the hallway, and I start complaining about this limitation that I can't seem to work out for my study, and Lori says, well, there's a technical solution that you can do to eat that I didn't know. There's things like that as a way of blending. And actually done studies that show that it's not so much putting teams together that are diverse and saying working on things, but setting up an atmosphere in a building where people just kind of bump into each other like particles of matter. And the chance encounters actually are what drives.
Interestingly, that was sort of the idea behind this brown bag thing in the first place. It was like, I had finished the Harvard Management or Innovation Implementation course, and that was one of the concepts in it. So I was like, well, how could we apply that here? And this is just sort of like, you just create a topic of discussion that then in just, people talking about it might create one of those moments.
Mm-hmm. Right, because look at our group here, we have people that, some that are that we normally see and others that we don't, but we're all here around an interest of a topic. So, you created, by doing that, you created the opportunity for these random meetings to happen as opposed to me doing the same topic at an ID meeting where it's the same group. That's great.
And, what ways can I make it more formal or less formal? So,
yeah.
On the one hand, I have PowerPoint. On the other hand, there's pizza.
Pizza is formal, yeah. Should have worn my tie.
It's a necessity.
But it's also really interesting, with, someone had mentioned earlier about, like a lot of times with classes, instructors try and build interaction into it by forming teams. Whereas again, it's proven that, that doesn't, it's like applying a method that's so tried and true that never works, you do the same thing, because one of the things that the power in social networks and communities of practice are in the fact that they're not formalized. They're not people there that are there for a formal reason. People are there more for avocation than vocation. And they have a driving personal interest. That's a big defining and driving factor.
I think also just size matters. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, but if you teach a class of 15, it's a lot easier to kind of bring some informality into it if you're trying to do a lecture of 500, and you're right, Teams is almost too formal a concept.
Yeah, but what at that number, what are the what are the alternatives? Like one of the interesting things about MOOCs is that rather than the instructor breaking up into teams, MOOCs being free, there's not that formality of a formal course. So the instructor basically says it's up to you guys to organize how you want, and that's the power in it, is that the people that want to organize that way can, and they're doing it again for a personal reason as opposed to an externally imposed reason, So.
Was there a question?
No, Jackie just said she had to run, but thank you so much for this and including the campuses. So. Did you come across, Elizabeth, with looking at social networks? Like I know anthropologists looking at communities, and like at a certain point, a community will just become too big to sustain being a community, and it'll break apart, and two communities will form. have you seen the,
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that, and I can't remember what the name of the number is, like around 100, but I think this is, the interesting thing about, to me, is this is where math and social science can start coming together. So I think questions people look at is, how can, when a community gets too large, where are the fracture points
right, yeah,
going to be?
yeah,
So I think they've done studies like, you know, a karate club gets too big and they form rival karate clubs.
Right.
right,
It's sort of like that here with ITS though. I mean, we're so large that we're broken down into, you know, separate units, but if you go to a smaller campus, it's all one unit.
yeah, yeah.
So there's a closer knit community there.
Yeah, that's so true. Like I know from Brian and Heather,
Right.
is that the connections are so much tighter, the social connections,
Right.
just because of scale.
Right.
You know, it's easier to get everyone that needs to be there to make like something happen in the classroom together than it is here, where you know we may have to go to like TNS and CLC, you know,
Right.
and try and get them to work just distance one, you know. Some being located in USB 2, some in computer buildings, some here, you know.
I think one of the things, I think that was the startup book, one of their examples was they reorganized a company and it started not communicating well, and they did an analysis and they found a key connection in the lower ranks where everyone, and probably here is Barb.
Barb knows it all.
Where we all, a lot of people know to go to Barb because she has so many informal social connections and she's been around.
Right.
And so once they took that, they inadvertently took that connection away. So with something like Yammer, now that we have more informal data, can we start figuring out, okay, we know that Christian actually knows a lot about accessibility, so here's how you contact them.
Mm-hmm.
And things like that, so you're not forcing people to use the hierarchical model all the time.
Right.
Although sometimes you need the hierarchical model too.
Yeah. It's all, you're kind of damned if you do and damned if. It's just, it almost becomes a natural thing of numbers. As numbers increase, you know, the more of a structure needs to be kind of imposed just to.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily, I probably made it sound more evil than it really is, but I think it's just understanding what the implications are.
Right. It's an inevitability, and, you know, and with that inevitability comes benefits and limitations. And,
yeah. You know, I always think, you know, it's not either or, it's both and, so sometimes you need the top-down approach, and then sometimes we're probably better at the top-down approach, but can you also get a bottom-up approach that complements each other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you start getting into, okay, what is that particular community or culture value?
Yeah.
As far as in the individuals and how they see them, and you know, that'll determine, because you know that's why a lot of times, you know, if you look at things like informal and then try and impose it into a formal setting, why it fails is because it's two different value structures and what they're set up for. You know, it's Goddard's law. Once you measure something, you've inherently changed what that something is by measuring it. You've made it different. And, you know, like being in education, I know that we constantly, you know, trip over that. We constantly do that. Immediately say, we got to do this or this like, without ever realizing that these likes are different and they work for a totally different reason than what we're here for. So what do we do well, and how do we improve on that? That's mine. So far.
Yeah, I was thinking, because we talked about those educational games, people play the games they want to play because they like them, but then once you start saying you have to play this claim in the classroom, it's not fun anymore.
It's totally different, yeah.
So does that mean it's completely worthless? Maybe not, but you have to factor that
Right.
into your
Right.
design.
Because there are, and then conversely, there are values in the power of simulations and going through events, like psychological studies have shown that visualizing has the same effect on learning as actually doing. And so, so the idea of creating it, it's just that you need that kind of, you need the meeting of the scenario with the intrinsic motivation of wanting to do that, whereas, even if I'm a gamer, the idea of playing a game for class might not thrill me, whereas if if I want to learn how to fly a plane, the idea of sitting in a flight simulator and crashing in that is a lot more appealing than, and so it's kind of, what are the things best used for,
What are the to me, it's sort of what are the trade-offs? Is the educational benefit of making you do the simulation enough that
Right.
you're going to still make students do it whether they want to or not?
Right. Right, because it's, the alternative can be just as bad as where you sit there and you load up people with factual and conceptual information. They can sit there and tell you what they would do if the building was on fire. It's another thing to actually have fire drills so you know what to do and what becomes distinctive. So. But thank you. This was really good. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for
And we made a new connection, right?
Yeah.
Right? So now we have a tie-in with Workforce Ed. We have a node.
Node. Can we exploit it? Well, thanks everyone. Good questions, by the way.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, thank yous from the.
Yeah, we'll probably be hanging up by. Oh, okay, everyone's gone.
Yeah.